I'm Dr. Robert Good. I'm a practicing internist in Central Illinois and a past president of the ACOI. And welcome to Solid on this beautiful day in March. And this evening, we are welcoming the discussion about the third year as your life starts to change from classroom to hands-on clinical work. So this evening, I'm welcoming Dr. Ryan Zimmerman, a good friend from Pennsylvania, who is the director of osteopathic education and associate program director of the Tower Health System at the Reading Hospital. So Ryan, and I think your cohort, I don't see her on here yet. Dr. Brown, is she joining us tonight too?
She is. I just texted her and she's going to be joining us as soon as Zoom permits. So I'll just begin whenever suits and she'll jump in then.
Okay, well, I'm going to let you start the program this evening, and welcome to the Solid meeting.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Good. And thanks, everybody. Thanks all the students for joining tonight on an evening. And thank you to the ACOI for the invitation to speak, and especially to the Solid program. So let me just begin my screen share and confirm that that's visible to the group.
Looks good.
Good. Okay, great. So to all the students, the point of our evening is for discussing tips for success in your clerkship rotations. Basically, the perspectives of a semi-quasi program director and a real-life clerkship director. So as we begin, I'd like you to consider two questions, which are listed here for you. What concerns you the most about beginning clerkships? And second, what can we talk with you about to help you the most? So consider those two questions during this sort of intro phase. And I'm going to ask you to share that in the chat. And I'll come back to it in a few minutes, see if there's anything for fodder. And probably the most important is, what can we talk about to help you the most? So some introductions about me and Dr. Brown. This is a picture of Reading Hospital. We've both been there for over 10 years. It's a really wonderful facility. Tim knows it. He's been there for family healthcare purposes. It's a really awesome hospital in Reading, Pennsylvania, 750 beds. And we have an internal medicine residency where we've been teaching students and residents for decades. I love it there. I trained there and plan to stay here for my career. So this is a picture of my partner, Dr. Brown, who joined us. She's a clerkship director. We work in the same office, so we're both ambulatory internal medicine specialists. And she takes under her tutelage over 6 or so medical students over the course of each year as the ambulatory medicine clerkship director for Drexel. So she's got a lot of great experience on the ins and outs of what makes a successful clerkship and what are some of the things to avoid. So her perspective is really helpful for you tonight, and she does not have any financial disclosures. That's a younger version of me. I'm the director of osteopathic education at the residency program. I've been there since I graduated from BCom in Blacksburg, was the AOA program director, and now this job. I need to disclose I have a role at ACGME, but my work tonight does not represent the ACGME or the committee work that I work on, and received an honorarium from the ACOI once, which was donated back to the foundation. So that's who we are and why we think it's good to be able to speak with you tonight. So we're both in education and believe in learning objectives. So at the end of the lecture, I want you to be able to list the key steps in clerkship preparation. That's the first objective. The second is to leverage your clerkships for professional development. And finally, to differentiate your skill set from the peer group to improve your rankability. So think about it as auditioning well. A couple of ground rules. First, please participate. I'd appreciate if students would be so willing as to go camera on if you're able to and comfortable with that. The reason for that is, honestly, I feel like I'm just talking to my desk and it's more fun for me to have an audience. If you could keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking, but be active in the polls. And if we call on you, please feel free to unmute and there will be time for discussion at the end. Next, please focus. It's very tempting when working on a computer to be doing your email and checking out your rotation assignments for the next day, but consider this studying. It's 30 minutes of preparation, and I really think you'll get more out of it if you're focused. And please follow up with us with email and questions and feedback. I'd love to hear from you about how we can change this talk. So let's see if anything has hit the chat. The chat is quiet, Dr. Brown. So that's okay. Hopefully the objectives match what you guys need. And there we go. Genthiel says, expectations from preceptors for us. That's really good. And we are definitely going to cover that in our talk. So as you think of more, feel free to chat more, and we'll just proceed along with the presentation. Dr. Brown, you're muted.
Sorry, I forgot that I do that automatically. Okay. So we'll start here by just talking about preparing for success. So I think one of the most important things that you can do to prepare for clerkships is, first and foremost, just read all the documents that you're given. So review your rotation expectations and your clerkship curriculum. You will undoubtedly be emailed beforehand rotation start times, details about where to report, and sometimes people miss those important things: how to get your login for your for your electronic health record access. And all of those things are usually contained in documentation from the College of Medicine or from the clerkship. And it can be really frustrating to have people repeatedly ask questions that are already available, or to miss things that were made available to them. The other thing that I'd highly recommend is to identify key resources for self-guided learning. So if you're on general surgery, figure out what's a good resource for general surgery. If you're on pediatrics, maybe it's the Harriet Lane Pediatrics Manual. We mostly utilize UpToDate and things like the Annals of Internal Medicine in the clinic articles. So you should identify key resources so that when a resident or an attending says, hey, we just saw a patient with DKA, why don't you go look that up? And then when we meet up in a half an hour, you can tell me a little bit about what you learned about management. So you need a quick resource to be able to do that on the fly. And you might also have something from the College of Medicine that you attend that highlights materials for the specific rotation. So you need to prepare for clerkships. And so what does that mean? Well, first of all, you need to make sure you know where you're going. And I can't understate or overstate, I should say, the fact that it can be very confusing to figure out where to report. So, where to park, how to get to the Department of Medicine or to the OR where you're supposed to meet your resident. So give yourself a lot of extra time. So it might even, if it's your first time to a new hospital, it might even be a good idea to, drive there the night before and make sure you know where you're going, so you don't spend a half an hour trying to find. I remember when I was a student, I couldn't find the dialysis unit, which is where I was supposed to meet the nephrologist. It took me 20 minutes. I was late. So think about that in advance to give yourself extra time. And then especially when you're starting your rotation, make sure you have a small footprint. So don't necessarily bring your book bag and your laptop and, all of your, studying supplies on day one, because there may be certain hospitals where you have to have a small footprint because there may not be a lot of space for you to store things. And most importantly, there may not be a very safe space for you to keep something like a laptop or your iPad if you're not keeping it on your person. So try to have a small footprint, even if it's just bringing your coat that you leave in the resident lounge, and that's it for day one, because you're not sure what else you can keep there. So one of the most important things you should do for growth and to do as well in your clerkships as possible is to really give yourself a set of goals. So as you start and as you go through rotations, you'll have feedback from your attendings, and try to incorporate that feedback into your goals and objectives for the next rotation. So when you start, you should say, I was told that I really need to work on presentation, so that's my goal for this rotation. And then make it something that you can work on with your attending or with your resident, something that's observable. So if you were told that, you frequently um, miss elements of the history, go through and say, well, this is what I'm going to work on. I'm going to work on my OQPRST for every chief complaint. Or if you need to work on physical exams. So have a goal in mind to help you grow throughout that rotation and make it something that you've been given feedback on in the past. And so one of the things we talk about is how to make sure you're longitudinally growing throughout your clerkships, how to learn whether or not, or how to trial if this specialty is right for you, if this is a career that you would want to have. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So when you first start, and it's something that you're interested, try on the career, ask your residents, what's their training experience look like? What are their hours like? What are their days like? Why did they pick this specialty? And what was their pathway there? Some people that match into competitive specialties, like say ophthalmology, they do a research year. Did they have to do that? Why? How did it help? So ask the residents how they got to where they are. Ask the attendings what they like about their job. Are they happy? If they were starting over, would they do the same residency fellowship? Would they do that same path again? Or what have they learned that might impact where they are? And then if you're at a program that you really like, you want to explore that program a little bit. So figure out what's the sense of culture at that residency. Do the residents really seem to hang out? Is there a lot of camaraderie? Do they like the community in which they live? Could you see yourself in that community, living maybe more urban, maybe more rural? So explore that career a little bit, but also explore the residency. So what we really want is for you to take it from a clerkship experience to being able to really experience the clerkships, to really get the most out of it. And some ways that you can do that are really to build your skills. And there's this common uh, refrain, or this common theory, that in order to become an expert in anything, you need to put in about 10,000 hours. So if you're an expert violinist, you've practiced for 10,000 hours. And something like that probably holds true for medicine as well. So you want to present every single chance that you get. So when you're rounding, don't fade into the background. Let your resident know, I'm prepared to present to the attending today, and present every chance you get. Participate in rounds. Speak up if somebody asks a question and you know the answer, or you know participate in a way if there's a task that needs to be done, you volunteer to do it. And really, when you're in medical school, you carry many fewer patients, so you should really know those patients inside and out better than anyone else. And examine every patient. So when you're tagging along with your resident and they listen to the heart, you listen too, because hearing 10,000 normal heart sounds will help you pick out that abnormal. And by doing all of these things, you'll put yourself in a position to really grow throughout third year. And you also want to do unique things. So, tag along when someone says they're going to do a knee injection, and put yourself in a position to be able to get experiences, whether they're procedural or seeing an interesting patient that you may never get again on outside of that rotation. And then the other thing we recommend, to get a sense of if you're growing, and to get a sense of where your career interests lie and where your specialty interests lie, is to really track your growth. And there's a lot of ways to do that. So you can note it on a phone or journal. You can write down um, what you liked about the day, what you didn't like about the day, but record something in the same place so that you have that to look back. If you're really trying to decide, I was just talking to a medical student, and they had to declare if they want to do surgical or non-surgical track as an MS3, and he was just so torn between surgery and pediatrics, and those are very different specialties. And as I was talking to him, I realized that he didn't really take the time to digest those rotations when he was on them, and instead he was trying to look in hindsight and look retroactively and say, what did I like about these things? So I think that If you can record your feelings about the specialty, about the work, about the patients you saw, and how you felt, it may help you as you come to make those crucial decisions. The other thing that's really important so that you can grow and you can utilize your clerkship experiences is you need to request feedback. So you need to make sure that you're asking your attendings and your residents in a timely manner for feedback. And that's both summative and formative. So when we talk about summative feedback, we talk about the day-to-day things. So after an observed skill or patient encounter, if there's something in particular you're working on, ask that attending, did I cover everything on that knee exam? Was my presentation organized? Do it in the moment, and link it to your objectives. If you're working on presentation, then ask in the moment about presentation. But the thing that you want to really avoid is the nebulous, anything I can do better. Time and time again, the medical students, when they're end of the day, they've got their book bag on, they've got their jacket on, and they come up to me and I'm working, I'm doing my in basket, writing my notes, and they say, is there anything else you need from me? Any feedback for the day? And it's just not the right, it's just not the right environment. Like, obviously they're on their way out the door. It's kind of a required question. Hey, I'm leaving. You got anything for me? So I would make sure you do it when that experience is very fresh for the attending, for the resident. And then the other important thing, and this goes back to reading all the emails and understanding the clerkship curriculum, is to know the evaluation process. So are there meetings for midpoint feedback and end of rotation feedback? So that would be very formalized feedback that clerkship directors will often give you. And then one other important thing is to identify who does your evaluation. So at some institutions, the residents contribute. That's how our inpatient internal medicine is. But other residency or other rotations, it may only be the attending. So you have to figure out how the process is at that rotation, because if you never present on rounds in front of the attending, and you never present to the attending or do any direct observation with the attending, but the attending is the only person who does your evaluation, you're not really giving the best opportunity to show yourself. And so, along with requesting feedback, as people grow through their MS3 year and they decide what they want to do for their career and for their specialty, um, they'll think about requesting letters of recommendation for residency. And so, a couple of key points that I think are important both for feedback and for letters of recommendation are asking early. So, if you've identified, I want to do pediatrics, and you've had a really good pediatric uh, rotation, you want to make sure that you ask at the end of that rotation, or even if you're on an audition rotation. So, say you're doing a sub-I and you've identified internal medicine, or you've identified this is your surgical sub-I, you've identified it as your specialty you want to do, you can make that part of your rotation objectives. Not that you would necessarily ask on day one, but you can, if you're working with an attending, it's week 2 or something like that, and they ask you what your objectives are, you can say, well, I really have these objectives to grow these skills, but one of my other objectives is to demonstrate that I'm a strong candidate and to ask for a letter of recommendation if I'm able to do that. Something like that to make it known early. And I think there's a couple of important key points for that. One is that if you don't ask at the end of that rotation and instead you wait 6 months until ERAS comes out, it's very likely that that attending has forgotten a lot about you. Somebody asked me to write a letter, and I had rotated with them in September, and now this was June. And in that intervening time, I had 24 medical students. So it's very difficult to remember specific details. They were a great student, but it's just hard to remember specific details of that student's performance because it's so long. So if you ask early, there's a better chance that the attending writes it early and that there's more specific details about your performance. Be prepared. So when you get your AAMC letter ID, make sure you give that to your attending because you can't submit the letter without that. So that's just part of being organized and being prepared. And giving your CV can help a little bit so that it can jog their memory, give some background to the letter of recommendation, and then follow up. So I usually recommend, and I actually will tell the students when they ask me for a letter of recommendation, absolutely, I'll write it for you. Send me a reminder in a month, because sometimes weeks go by really quickly. You get really busy with life, with work. And so they'll send me it in a month and I'll say, oh my goodness, I didn't write that yet. But also be patient. So don't email them every 2, 3 days or every week to say, hey, did you write my letter yet? As you're getting closer to the ERAS deadline and you have maybe had 3 or 4 monthly emails to remind them, then you can maybe send another email or shorten that interval. But you also may have to realize that lots of times, unfortunately, medical students ask for letters and the attendings don't write them in a timely fashion. So that's something to really identify, as well as who can be a good letter writer. So clerkship directors, those of us who teach a lot of medical students, write a lot of letters of recommendation. So it can be helpful to identify those types of attendings as well. Not that a community physician who doesn't write letters wouldn't write a good one, but typically those of us who do it frequently have a little bit better of a flow, I would say. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Zimmerman.
Well, you know what, Dr. Brown, there's some good stuff in the chat. Why don't we just tackle some of these questions quick? Um, Early on, it was a theme of how do we know what our preceptors expect of us? Can you talk to that?
So first and foremost, ask. So when I have people, when I'm with my students, I have a clerkship curriculum and it literally says, I expect you to write this many notes per day. I expect you here at this time, you'll leave about this time. I expect that you will see this many patients. And then on top of that, Drexel gives certain rotation objectives as well. But if you are, and this happens to all of us in medical school, you kind of get on these like loosey goosey rotations. You're not sure what's expected of you. Should I see this patient? Should I not see the patient? Am I supposed to go with the intern? The best thing to do is just kind of ask, like to start with, ask your intern, ask your resident, and then ask your attending. So, if you're on, for my experience coming from an internal medicine, ask your attending, like, would you like me to present every day on my patients instead of the intern presenting, or both of us present, if you have a question. But I would just say, like, try to ask if those are not clear. And I actually think a lot of attendings will respond really well to that because they'll view that as engagement. I think you should try to avoid the nebulous, like, oh, like, the 4 o'clock, do you want me to see that patient? Because that's not necessarily falling within expectations. But sometimes my medical students will ask, like, you know, would you like me to write a note on that patient? And sometimes I'll say no, because it has to be in a very specific format for the surgeon, right? But they'll ask up front so that they're clarifying what their expectation is. And I don't think anybody is ever offended by a respectful question about their expectations.
Well said. Logan wondered what to do about feeling in the way. That's a pretty honest question.
Oh yes. Well, I wish there was a great answer to that, but I think some of that will just come. Um, and I think as the role of medical students has contracted a little bit in terms of what Medicare allows you to do, and in terms of the role of a student in a lot of senses, even 20, like even when I was in medical school, like we would write everything in the notes and our residents would just co-sign them. And that just really doesn't exist anymore because of some of the Medicare changes. So there will be times when you feel like you're in the way, but those are the times where you try to identify, like, what does this patient need that my resident or attending um, doesn't have the opportunity to do? So I think that, things like calling the pharmacy to see like when the medications were last refilled, um, offering to like call the social worker at their facility because they need X, Y, or Z for safe discharge. So like look for the hidden opportunities to do more. And I think that those are sometimes ways to help without feeling like you're in the way.
Well done. Meghana wondered about clinical skills before starting clerkships. I'll just say that your preceptors will explain to you what's expected of you, and that should also be in any curriculum. for the most part, procedures are not going to be done without a resident or an attending involved for patient safety. So I don't think you need to get to the sim lab too often to practice intubation. That'll be done with elbow support.
Hmm.
Donna asked about expectations. So we had a lot about expectations. Celine asked about adjusting to the clinical setting. And that's kind of the theme of the evening. I would just suggest embrace it as best you can. And we'll come back to that, I think, in the end when we're in more open discussion. Let's see,
Yeah.
Angela wondered about choosing rotation orders. How about we save on that one, Angela? Bring that back at the end because I think that's worth talking about back and forth about sequence of
And
rotation.
I'll just comment once on the question, how frequently should you ask for feedback? And I would say that again goes back to like what you're working on and the individual skill that you were demonstrating. So I again avoid the nebulous end of the day or random like, hey, Dr. Brown, do you have a second? Can I ask you for feedback? If there's nothing concrete there. So what I would say is like if you were with your resident and they sent you to the emergency room, you took a history, you came back, you presented them in that moment, ask for feedback. Like they went to see the patient and then you ask like, were there elements that I missed? Was there a better way to connect to my differential diagnosis? So always make it relevant to the thing that you're just doing, because I think it's really hard to ask people to recall. We've, as physicians, there's literature on this. We make like literally 10,000 decisions a day, where the average person makes like half that or something like that. So when you're asking out of context, you're a little bit asking people to just recall from a blank slate. So just really tie it in the either in the moment or even if it's a couple hours later after lunch. When I saw that patient, and you asked me to do a volume assessment, like did I hit all the key points? Keep it relevant is what I would say about feedback. And then make sure you have structured time to sit down for midpoint feedback. So if things aren't going well, you can course correct. And then end of rotation feedback so that you can really have an overview. And good clerkships will have a structure to gather feedback, like we do here, to gather feedback from all the people you work with and kind of put it together for you.
Madeline said about feeling embarrassed when you don't know the answer to the question. That's very, very kind. Get over that. You're not going to know a lot of what you're about to encounter. What you learned in the first 2 years are foundations that you now need to go apply in clinical scenarios you've never faced. And if you're not learning constantly, you're not realizing that you're learning. Educators want to help you, and so we're going to try to find a gap or help you to learn to identify gaps. And that should not be a matter of embarrassment in as much as a chance to grow. Just today, I had a third-year resident presenting a case to me. He's a little cocky, feeling good about what he's about to go do in his life. And I asked him something, he didn't know it, and furiously had to look it up and said to his medical student, it's okay. Medicine is expansive and we learn every day. And I thought that was actually a nice little teaching moment from him. Angela brought up some sequence. We'll get to that, I think, a little bit later. Feedback, letters of recommendation, give them appropriate information to jog the memory of the student experience at the rotation site to help them write the letter of recommendation. Let's go to that, Krista, because you just talked about letters.
Yeah, I'm trying to find who jog my memory, who said that.
Megana at 818.
Oh, yeah, so I think this is very dependent on the attending, but also something that I think you can wordsmith a little bit. So I personally, when somebody asks me for a letter, I'll say, well, tell me a little bit about what you think your strengths are and what you would want highlighted in the letter. And that helps me both from gain their perspective, but also sometimes it helps me just jog my memory of like my experience with them. But what you could do, and what I would recommend to my mentees, is to say, Doc, such and such, I really enjoyed our time together. We saw that great case of, perforated diverticulitis, and I was so impressed by like how smoothly things went in the OR and blah, blah, blah. Like, so you can like give a specific example where maybe you and the attending worked together on a case and it went really well, and maybe that highlighted your skills. One of the medical students who asked me for a letter of recommendation, like, just recalled like a specific patient encounter, like that we had together, and how formative that was for them, because it taught them something really important about how they would structure their patient education going forward. And they gave that example to me in an email, and I thought that was actually a really nice way to impress upon me as a letter writer why they're so interested in internal medicine, but it also truly just helped me jog my memory of them. So you can maybe try to, without being braggadocious, just highlight some experiences from that rotation that were maybe formative to you. And that will both give a little bit of fodder for your letter of recommendation, but I also think jog that memory, but also I think put a little positive spin when your attending's like, what, that's so cool that they remember that. And, so I think there's a lot of reasons why that would work, but that's kind of my way to metagame it, is what I would say.
That's great. Thanks, Dr. Brown. And a great segue actually into the next portion about auditioning well. And one of the things I'll suggest is about how to be a memorable student. So let's go back to your own reflection and consider for the next minute, what is your most valuable asset that you bring to a future residency program? Really think about that. That's an interview question, but also an inward reflection question. And how are you going to show this attribute on your clerkships, students? And how are you going to show that you're a good fit to the residency program? So this is a countdown that's going to last 1 minute. Think about that for the next 35 seconds. And you may not know this quite yet about yourself, but each of you brings something different to a program that might make you a good fit to that residency. And you want to know how to showcase that, which is what I'm going to talk about here in a moment. And if you feel up to it and you feel confident, share it in the chat as I go through the next few slides. So when programs are looking for future residents, they're trying to identify what we call a good fit. And that's a bit of a nebulous term, and it means something different to each program. But I think you could distill it down to a number of attributes. And when I got my rank list back, or I'm sorry, my match list, I realized, yeah, my residents next year have these attributes because that's what I'm looking for in my future residents. We're looking for team players that are professional, dutiful, self-directed. I'm looking for people who are osteopathic, and the ACOI can attest to that. A visible and memorable student who's going to do well. So let's go through each of these. How can you be collaborative and value added? Dr. Brown touched on these a little bit. Think about each day as an opportunity to help your resident and program to do something that's a little bit time consuming. There was a question before, how do I make sure I'm not in the way? Do these tasks. Call a pharmacy and ask for the most recent fill dates on anticoagulation or diuretics. Measure orthostatic vital signs. That can be a pretty time-consuming moment. A pill-by-pill medrec, where you literally take the pill bottles and compare it to the computer screen, is extremely valuable and a big learning moment for you guys to see what pills actually look like in a bottle. Take a social history. These are things that can really add color and shade to the patient history and will make a big difference and will make you look very valuable. There's an attending in our institution. He directs a surgical program and says a bit blithely, medical students are like a wedge. The simplest tool, you just need to know how to use them. So think of that and be a wedge. Be professional. You've got to meet or beat the dress code. I suggest you wear a clean white coat and name badge every day. Arrive early and do Dr. Brown's pre-visit arrival routine. Be enthusiastic and engaged. Very often I have students who are clearly not interested in internal medicine, and that is unprofessional. You got to understand this is my job and these are my patients, and it's a privilege for everybody to be a part of that care team. And if you show that you honor that moment, I think that professionalism follows very naturally. Be mindful of your cell phones. It may be your only way to connect with your family or to look up things on rounds. But when we have students who are on their phone all the time, it really looks like you might be disengaged. So if you're using your phone, I suggest kind of announcing why you're on it. Oh, I'm going to look up the guidelines, or I just need to return this message, something along those lines. And it needs to be shared with everybody that if you're on your phone, it looks like you're not paying attention. Be unimpeachable, okay? If there's an allusion to unprofessional behavior, you lose your rank position. And I can guarantee that because programs are not looking to match with people who could bring problems. So be unimpeachable. Let's just take a minute though to talk about dress code. This is evidence that will show you that you need to look like you belong there. So this was a study published in, I think, 2018, where lay people were given pictures of doctors dressed in different ensembles. And you can see there men and women in casual white coat, formal, etc. And they said, what do you want your doctor to wear? So in the Family Feud style, survey says patients want the doctors wearing formals and a white coat. So for men, that's shirt and tie. For women, that's dress clothes and a white coat. Up to you about the tie, because there's some data about fomites. Personally, I'm a tie guy. Second to that was scrubs and a white coat. So the formal business is not necessary with like a dress jacket like I'm wearing, but you need to wear your white coats. They went on to then ask these lay people, what job do you think this person has? So I'll draw your attention to figure 3B, which is kind of the bottom right-hand side, where they were given pictures of people in white coats, scrubs, and fleece jackets. By far and away, lay people identified those in white coats as physicians. And if they were wearing a fleece, they were listed as a medical technician or a physician assistant. So you guys are already going to be asked on rounds, how old are you? Are you old enough to be a doctor? And that's a very embarrassing question you're going to get. And if they think you're also a PA or a med tech, good luck. So I suggest to you, wear the white coat you get from medical school. Okay, back to the attributes. I suggest that you should be dutiful. This means following through on assignments and things you say you're going to do. So if you're given a reading assignment by Dr. Brown, you really need to complete that reading assignment. It's best if you can do it on your own without being prompted, and be prepared for, hey, do you remember we talked about this? Let me give an example. A student in our office past 2 weeks, we had a very interesting case of a rare form of diabetes called MODY, mature onset diabetes of the young. Kind of rare, very good learning opportunity. I said, read 3 things, tell me tomorrow what you learned about MODY. We'll talk about it. Next day, hey, what'd you do? I didn't read about it, sorry. And Carol, I see you're rolling your eyes. What do you think about that? Not a good look, is it? No. And I was a little deflated, honestly, because I was, excited to talk about MODY, and now it's just me and my MODY. So honestly, it doesn't make you look good if you don't follow through on your assignments. Next is attend conferences, attend meetings, don't miss anything, because you don't want to drift off in the background like Dr. Brown suggested. That is not a good look. And complete all your administrative clerkship tasks. So if you need to log your procedures or your patient hours, make sure you're doing all those things as you go along. Here's a tough one, guys. Be self-directed. And this is a hard skill you may not have encountered much in your medical school unless you're doing like a practice-based learning environment, or sorry, problem-based learning. But I really recommend that you keep a list of topics from the day to review every night. And if you learn from your patients, you'll learn better than you learn from textbooks. But the next day, be ready to synthesize this clinically and have a succinct summary. So very often I'll say to my students, okay, tonight, read about the 3 different kinds of primary headaches, and tomorrow tell me how to compare and contrast them, right? And so then the next day they'll launch into a review of pathophysiology and biochemistry and mechanism of action of medications. And that's not what we're doing in clinical work, right, Carol? And you've seen this. And so it almost becomes a little daunting. And what we're trying to do is help you to move this into clinical applications. So just a moment of real talk. Don't be long-winded or annoying at the end of the day. Everybody's trying to get home, and you've excited, you're trying to show what you learned, but be succinct, keep it clinical, and the attendings are going to be excited to talk with you. Oops, I skipped a slide. Some evidence from a journal of American Journal of Surgery from 2018, where they asked students, what do you think about self-directed learning? And the students on their clerkships found that independent learning assignments improved learning, improved performance, and the students assigned it did better on their shelf exams. So self-directed learners perform better on the rotations, right? So figure out what you need to learn it, and you'll do better. Be osteopathic. That's who we are, right? This is ACOI. I think if you bring up OMM or OPP, you're really going to separate yourself from the pack. If a preceptor offers you the chance to do OMM, you just found a very unusual moment, sadly, because it doesn't happen nearly as often as we should be treating patients. So jump in and put your hands on patients. Show the attending you can be assessing the whole patient, and applying osteopathic principles beyond OMM. And I'd encourage you to ask your residents and ask your attendings why they do or don't do OMM, and learn from that and decide, is this a part of your career that you're really looking for? And I could talk a long time about osteopathic recognition, but I'll save that for another talk. But show that you are a DO, and DO programs are really going to find that very attractive. Be visible, guys. I think Dr. Brown spoke to this, so I don't want to repeat anything that she said, but be in conferences, be engaged, present, meet the program director if you can, especially if they're giving a lecture, and show that you fit in with the culture of the program. Be memorable, and we got to a lot of this on your conversations about letters of recommendation, but be memorable for good reasons. A couple of really helpful ways to be memorable are to follow up on research projects with residents. So if you can get involved in a case report that's going to take a few weeks to complete, you're going to be remembered by those residents. I would suggest, if you learn something from Dr. Brown and you take it to your next rotation and apply it, email her a little note that says, hey, when you taught me volume assessment, I was able to do that on words. It really helped me. Thanks a million. That really shows a lot of engagement. And I think it never happens. I've never had this happen, but I would love for that to happen. And if this is a little bit of an aside, but if somebody suggests you check out a restaurant or a social function or a sporting event, let them know that you did it. I think that just shows a little bit of a human connection. And you've got to remember that the match is dating, but now it's online because we never meet anybody and everything is video interviews. And so you've got to figure out a way to stay connected in a virtual means. And those little moments would, I think, really help you rise up on a rank list. So that was our talk. Let's conclude with the objectives and then get into some open discussion. So our first objective was that we want you to be able to list the key steps in clerkship preparation. That was to read, digest, and apply the course materials you got, and to be goal-oriented. Dr. Brown also showed you how to leverage your clerkships into professional development. So this is not only the content, but what it is to try on the career and to reflect on your growth as you go. And I showed you a few ways to try to differentiate yourself from the pack to improve your rankability. I'd like to just move into open discussion, if that's okay with you, Dr. Good.
Yes, sir. Good idea.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop sharing here, but one last look at our old pictures, and those are our email addresses if anybody needs them. It's first.lastname@towerhealth.org. Okay.
All right. Is there any areas that you find that are common areas where students miss it, either clinically or otherwise?
Students
I would
miss it.
say-
Krista, do you want to take that one?
Well, I would say one big thing is being given an assignment and not reading up on it. And I think that is an easy thing to do well, and I think most of the time it's quite innocent. But keep a notebook or keep a note on your phone, or have a place. A lot of you guys will get these cool soap notebooks, but have a place in there to write down, like, Dr. Brown told me to look up what is, like, the other day I gave somebody assignment of, tell me, does nocturnal oxygen therapy actually change mortality or cardiovascular outcomes? Because we do it all the time, but just does wearing oxygen at night really help anybody? And then I asked him the next day, and he forgot to look it up. And I think it was innocent, and he was very remorseful. But it doesn't give you that pow of like, wow, this is an honor student. So have a structure, have a system for looking up things you don't know. Um, and so I think that's one of the biggest misses. And I think the other big miss is in internal medicine is people not having a good resource to find things. So in our institution, our residents all use UpToDate, but our local medical schools oftentimes don't buy UpToDate for their students anymore. And so I often find them, they're using Amboss, they're trying to like Google things, they're trying to look things up on PubMed, and they're not getting to the right answer. But if you used a good resource like Dynamed, a point of care evidence-based resource like Dynamed or UpToDate, you'd often find those topics within 2 to 3 minutes. And so identifying those resources early on. And I don't know what people like for an ophthalmology, everybody uses the Wills Eye manual. So if you're like on an audition rotation, like get your Wills Eye manual ready. So make sure you have something, because a lot of times I'll ask people to look stuff up and they're not really sure where to look, and then they come back and they don't really have that topic honed down because they didn't have the right resources.
Okay.
One other thing I would say, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm just
Well,
launching into the next one.
I was just actually going to bring up a point on dress code, because since the pandemic, that's something that has really, really evolved. And I think of debate in the world about who wears scrubs and who doesn't, and to the point where like attending sometimes get heated about it. So what I would give you the advice of students is beat the dress code in the beginning. If you don't know, like, wear your professional dress, wear your white coat, right? And then the best thing to do then, if you don't really want to wear professional, or you really want to do scrubs, is kind of what your attendings wear is the best thing. In our office, nobody wears scrubs. So if the students show up and they wear scrubs, it's a little off. On the inpatient rotation, a lot of the attendings do, but some of them don't. So make sure you're kind of matching what your attending does, because I think I see a lot of students and they all wear fleeces and scrubs, but it's a little bit of contrast because that's not what their attendings wear. And I just think if their attending is wearing a tie and a white coat and that's their expectation, and you're not meeting that expectation, you could, and it's not right, but you could potentially be introducing some bias into your evaluation. We're all biased, right? We all have certain ideas about ways that things should or shouldn't be. Those cognitive biases are all there. So I would just keep that in mind, because I think the dress code of medicine in 2024 has definitely changed, and I don't have an opinion about that per se, but I'm just here to tell you what to do to be best on your evaluation. So think about that, mirror your attending.
Dr. Brown, you always have an opinion on matters. You're being very discreet.
I don't think her opinion is much different than the rest of us. However,
some good advice I got is look like you belong there. And so you have to look like you're a doctor. And if the office is wearing a tie, you should wear a tie. If your attending is wearing scrubs, match the attending. Very often in procedural rotations, surgeons will show up in a shirt and tie, change into a scrub, and change back in a shirt and tie. And if that's what they're doing, you should do the same thing.
any other questions from the students? This is for you. When should a student show up? Let's just say for morning rounds. when does a student, I mean, what time do they show up to start their rounds?
That's a good question. Maybe we could get some input from the group since I'm all in the office. If I'm there, I hope that my student and resident are there, which is before patient care begins and with enough time to sort of group think about how the schedule is going to work for the day. And that's usually 5 to 10 minutes beforehand. For the most part, there will have been a conference that occurred, and then it kind of naturally flows into the clinic rounds. What do you think, Krista and others in the group?
I think that's something where that's a perfect opportunity to just straightforward and politely ask like what the expectation is. Like, okay, like, I'm like, you're attending releases you for the day, and say, thank you for the day, sir. Like, what time would you like me, to come tomorrow? Or, I think too, like, I hope that your residents, when you're on inpatient rotations, would give you those expectations, but you should really mirror what your residents do, and they'll give you that background. But I think if you're not sure, it's always good to ask what the expectations are without necessarily asking, what time should I be here in the morning? Because sometimes that question can be off-putting, but you can literally ask, like, you ask your attending, ask your resident, would you like me to have pre-rounded and written notes on all the patients, like before we do morning walk rounds? And they might say, no, you don't have to write your notes. You can do that in the afternoon when you're in the resident workroom or something like that. So kind of frame it in the sense of, what are the expectations for you before you round with the attending and the residents? And that will help guide you, because some medical students may need to get there at 6 o'clock in the morning to see 2 patients, and some may need to get there at 5:30. So I would say start by clarifying what the expectations are for you by the time you start walk rounds, or by the time you go to the OR for the first case.
Yeah, like it may depend upon a little bit. It depends, right? If it's an ICU, you may want your patients seen early, before morning report, and in comparison to a different type of setting. I saw another good question here in the chat there, Ryan.
Is that about the sequence of rotations, Bob?
Yes, let's try to do that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of this is fixed by your school, and you may not have the chance to have the liberty of choosing the sequence of your rotations. I would say don't sweat it too much. There are many moving parts, and it's very difficult to make your schedule perfect. And each one builds on the other, so there's no perfect sequence. However, when it comes to audition rotation, so if you're really interested in a particular residency or specialty, I'd encourage that to be towards the beginning of the interview season, if at all possible. So that nationally is the end of September. We get to look at your applications and begin interviews in October through February. That's the ideal time for an audition rotation if you're able to get it. If you're not able to get it then, that is okay. Get it when you can. There are many moving parts that create a very complex, small window of opportunity for your various rotations. So take what you can get, is my suggestion. And you'll certainly do better in terms of your performance clinically on your later rotations, because you will have asked historical questions and done a clinical evaluation, and so your learning will be different. So for those really, really high yield rotations where you want to really excel, perhaps having a few under your belt just to have done a rotation might make you more successful. But each of them really overlaps with the other, and in some ways builds on the other. So my suggestion is kind of go with the flow and let it happen. A lot of this is up to your school. What do you guys think, Bob and Carol and others, about sequence of rotations?
Carol, I'm going to ask you that question.
All righty, thank you. I think you're absolutely spot on, Ryan. I think that so much stress is created that is really counterproductive. Just trying to game the system, if you will,
Right.
and figure out what to do, when to parlay this and that and the other. And I think that just having that, and I think Krista, your idea about journaling or whatever method to record how your feelings are, not just the academics, but the feelings for each rotation is a great idea, because that gives such a solid feedback reference for the individual as to what they might want to go into. But I think that your point about having some experience so that you can feel like you're a lot more, you're not going to be fully polished. I'm not fully polished, and I've been at it a few years, just ask Bob. And but on the flip side, I think that that does give you this sense of being more competent, more confident, and carrying yourself so that you do look and act like a doctor more so for those rotations and the specialties that you're the most interested in.
Yeah. There's a question here about research, how they might be involved. And I don't know if you want to approach that or not, either Ryan or Krista.
I think that's something, if you have a specific area of interest, so you're doing a GI rotation and you're interested in GI, you can certainly just easily ask your attending, is there anybody in the department who's actively doing research who you would recommend I speak with? That type of thing. There are not always a lot of clinical physicians who are doing a lot of research outside of bigger academic institutions. There are certainly opportunities for case reports. I know in our institution, usually the residents bring them or find them, and then we utilize the medical student who happened to be on the case at the time. But I think that's an easy thing to ask when you're on that rotation. Sometimes students will ask me and I say, that's not something that I really find personally fulfilling, so it's not part of my career right now. But here are some people who I could connect you with. And I would also ask your medical school, because a lot of you will have clerkship directors or have department chairs who are actively maybe doing research in an area of interest that you have, or can connect you with people that are.
I'll also plug the ACOI student abstract competitions at the National Convention. Great opportunity for you to do some scholarly work and maybe go to the resident and say, hey, I'm working on a case report. I'd like your opinion about this. And could you help me to finalize it? They need scholarship too. So you can lead the charge a little bit. I'd encourage you to think about almost everything you do is a teaching moment, and abstracts and conventions are about what's the teaching point and who's the audience. So for ACOI, that's osteopathic internists who practice general medicine. And if you can learn something from a case, there might be a case report in there. And doing it really helps you to do it. So don't be afraid to try to submit. But there's some really great work that happens with the ACOI conventions.
I'd also like to go through this one very good question about what's the best way medical students deal with doctors, nurses, patients who are rude to them. I think that's a really, really good question, because that's a tough one. And I think we probably all have a different response to that. But I would say, as a medical student, someone said in the chat earlier, and Dr. Zimmerman said, you want to be memorable for good reasons, not for bad reasons. And so even if you were engaged in a situation with a rude patient, or someone acted very unprofessionally towards you, you have to go high, right? And I think the best thing is to just disengage as much as you possibly can. Disengage from that situation, get out of there. If it's something egregious, unprofessional, patient safety is at risk, like a rude nurse or rude physician or something like that, resident attending, and a patient could be harmed, then you've got to tell the right people. You've got to tell your higher ups. But I would say, for the most part, even if someone is quite rude to you, you're not necessarily there to adjudicate their behavior. You're there to learn medicine, surgery, etc. So just try to disengage. And then if it's something very egregious, very offensive, you tell your clerkship site director, your coordinator, the program director, that this was your experience, and elevate it that way. But just try to personally disengage so you're not tangled in any sort of unprofessional stuff.
I will say to that, on May 16th, and Madeline, you asked the question, we're going to have a whole session on that nasty patient. So I think there's not anybody on this that's actively practicing that hasn't had a patient that has been not has been unkind, is a nice way of saying it, right? We've all run into circumstances where the patient is not the ideal patient. And anyway, we're going to have a whole session about that. That's in May. All right. Well, it's 7:59, and I'd like to start on time and end on time. I'd like to thank Dr. Brown and Dr. Zimmerman very much for your input tonight. I thought this was excellent. I hope the students come away with some good positive ideas about the way the clerkships are going to be and continue to learn and engage in your future. So thank you, doctors, for your input tonight.
You're welcome.
Our next session will be for Solid. Will be in 1 month from now in April, the 3rd Thursday. And we'll be talking about various specialties during that with various representatives of each specialty to go through. So Tim, you have anything else you want to add to our session tonight?
I just want to again thank everyone for joining this evening. I put a link in for the Solid program so you can pre-register for the April and May. And again, thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. Thank you, students, and thank you, other members of faculty. We have board members on here, Dr. Tolentino and others. Thank you all. This was a great session. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening.